Hi, my name is Lucy, and this is a special edition of Teen Pride Book Talks. This episode is being created as part of the 2023 Big Gay Read at the Ann Arbor District Library. And the book that has been chosen for the Big Gay Read this year is Last Night at the Telegraph Club by Malinda Lo. I have previously done a Teen Pride Book Talk on that book when it was first published. And so today I am going to talk about the book called A Scatter of Light. This was written by Malinda Lo and it was published in 2022. And it was published as a companion novel to Last Night at the Telegraph Club. And there are some characters from Last Night at the Telegraph Club who show up in this novel. Lily and Kath are there at some point, and you do find out more about their story, which is nice. But otherwise, I would say that this novel is pretty separate from Last Night at the Telegraph Club. A Scatter of Light takes place mostly in 2013. It starts in 2008, then goes to 2013, and then ends in 2023. And so it's a different time period, and it's not really an historical novel like Last Night at the Telegraph Club, but it does have an interesting history, which I will get to in a moment. The book is about a girl named Arya Tong West, who is a half Chinese, half white teenager from Massachusetts. And she is looking forward to graduating from high school, spending her summer on Martha's Vineyard with her friends, and then going to MIT to study astronomy in the fall. But unfortunately, something happens to her that's relatively scandalous. She's at a party with her boyfriend, and they are hooking up, and he asks if he can take a picture of her without her shirt on and without her bra on. She sort of says no, but he is pretty insistent, and he kind of just does it. And then he posts it, and it gets passed around. And so this is something that Arya is involved in, and Arya's friend who invited her to Martha's Vineyard sort of disinvites her. Her friends change plans, and so she has to go somewhere else, and she has to get away from this. This has been pretty devastating. So she gets sent to Marin County, California to spend the summer with her grandmother, Joan West. Her grandmother is also a pretty famous photographer, and Arya is packed up by her parents and sent to spend this quiet summer in Marin County. She's not that excited about it, but it becomes a pretty interesting summer for her. And this book is a book of self-discovery. It's definitely a coming-of-age book. It is a book about discovering your sexuality. It's also a book about messy relationships. Malinda Lo does not shy away from relationships that are not all nice and neatly packaged. So the bulk of this book takes place in 2013. This is the summer that Arya has gone to Marin County. And the beginning part that starts in 2008 is just a little snapshot where we learn about Arya's relationship with her grandmother, Joan, and why she calls her Joan and not grandmother or some name like that. And then, as I said before, there's a little snapshot at the end in 2023. So this book does bridge time in a really interesting way, but it centers in 2013. Arya arrives in Marin County, and she pretty instantly finds herself interested in and pretty attracted to her grandmother's gardener, Steph, who is described as androgynous, also butch. And she is from the Bay Area. Steph is from the Bay Area. Arya gets to know her better. Steph is older than Arya. She writes these ballads, these acoustic ballads that are based on the poems of Adrienne Rich. And this is essential to this book because the poetry of Adrienne Rich becomes important to Arya. And so it is sprinkled throughout the book in a really nice way. Passages from Adrienne Rich's poetry are incorporated into this story. One of the books that Arya really explores is the dream of a common language. This is given to her by Steph. This particular book is known for its celebration of women, its discussion of women's relationships with other women. Rich was in a long-term relationship with another woman, and Arya also finds a connection there and something to sort of grab onto, because what Arya is discovering is that she isn't maybe who she thought she was. And she's examining herself through the lens of her attraction to Steph. She gets pulled into Steph's older friend group a little bit. There's a girl named Mel who really takes Arya under her wing. Then there's Steph's girlfriend, Lisa. This part of this girl discovering her sexuality, this teenage girl, then being embraced by an older group of queer women reminded me of Last Night at the Telegraph Club and the way that Lily meets all these people at the Telegraph Club, and the way that Lily learns even from Kath about this whole world that she hadn't imagined was there or was available to her. And so the book centers on this blooming relationship and love between Arya and Steph. At the same time, Arya, who considers herself a scientist, is going to study astronomy, begins painting, and she's influenced by her artist grandmother. And she finds that she can use painting to express things and to learn things about herself in a way that she hasn't been able to give voice to. Arya also spends the summer reading her late grandfather's journals, his astronomy journals, and those are incorporated into the book, and also very important to Arya because they help give focus to grief that she is feeling about her grandfather dying. And then grief is a big part of this book in many ways for Arya and for her grandmother. Her grandmother lost her husband. Arya lost a grandfather. She lost a lot with her experience at the end of high school. She lost some friendships, she thinks, and she's grieving that. And then she also is spending a lot of time with her grandmother, Joan, and is wondering if she's losing her grandmother a little bit as well to dementia. And then there's the messiness component. So Steph has this girlfriend, Lisa. Steph and Arya start to connect. They start to go off alone together, and they begin this relationship. And knowing that Steph is in a committed relationship with someone else doesn't lessen Arya's feelings towards Steph or Arya's pull towards Steph. It doesn't really keep Arya from wanting to be with Steph or trying to be with Steph. And some might say this makes Steph and Arya's romance more compelling. It also makes it, I think, a little bit questionable that despite Steph being in a committed relationship, which may have its problems and does have its problems, that's an obstacle that Arya is really willing to push out of the way. That's also realistic. Arya is 18 years old, and she is feeling feelings she has never felt in her life. There's the messiness of this first real romance and this first love. There's the exciting discovery of realizing who she is and that she's attracted to this woman. And so it's not unlikely that Arya would do this, whether or not it's questionable. And I appreciate that Malinda Lo is willing to put this kind of messiness into this book and not tie this relationship up neatly and create this conflict. And Steph is not immediately ready to let go of Lisa. Lisa is part of this friend group that Arya is becoming part of, so that creates a lot of conflict there. And it's a little bit different from the Telegraph Club in this way. I think in the Telegraph Club, when I read that, I was really rooting for Lily and Kath to be together and to be able to figure out a way to do that. In this book, I felt conflicted because of the messiness. There is a connection, a direct connection in the book to the Telegraph Club because Arya is going to MIT to study astronomy, and she's reading her grandfather's astronomy journals. And then there's talk of Kath, this pilot, and Lily, who is interested in astronomy. And this is why you get a little bit of Lily and Kath's story at the end of this book, which is a nice way of having closure for this book, but also for the Telegraph Club. This book wouldn't necessarily traditionally be considered historical. There is an interesting history to it, as I briefly mentioned at the beginning. Malinda Lo started writing this book in 2013, and that is really why the bulk of the book takes place in 2013. 2013 is an interesting year historically because it is the year of the Supreme Court's rulings on same-sex marriage. And so that is in this book, and that's a backdrop for this book. She wrote this book in 2013, and I watched an interview with her where she explained that it was rejected dozens of times. And to her, some of those rejections even felt homophobic. In 2013, there were not a lot of books with LGBTQ plus characters. There were not many books at all with Asian characters. In fact, Malinda Lo looked into the statistics and learned that in 2013, only 29 LGBTQ plus books were published, not just in YA, but across the board. And only 18 books were with Asian characters at all were published. And those numbers are surprisingly small. And so in 2023, there's much more of a market for this book. Fortunately, we have seen more representation in books. It's important to have these books now, as a lot of them are being pulled back. And so the history surrounding the whole creation of this story is a very interesting piece of history. The book was originally set in Connecticut. Aria was going to be from Connecticut and spend the summer in Colorado. Malinda Lo finally found a publisher for this book when she wrote it, but he said, we can't publish it right now. And for the reasons that there weren't books with these type of characters out there. So she went and wrote a different book, and then she returned to A Scatter of Light. So some of the original bones are there. She couldn't set it in Connecticut and Colorado because she was finishing it during the pandemic and she couldn't travel. So she had to write it about Massachusetts, where she lives, and the Bay Area, where she'd also lived. And I find it fascinating to learn why these things happen in books. Sometimes it's just because of what is going on in an author's life. And I really like getting these backstories. Another way that this makes this book really interesting, the fact that it ended up being published after Telegraph Club, though it was written before, is that it was changed. It was changed location-wise. It was changed to include the Supreme Court decision. And it didn't change from 2013, mostly because Malinda Lo did not want to include the pandemic in her book. She wanted to write a book that didn't have that as part of it. The end of the book does take place in 2023, and we are able to follow this work of art that Aria has created, this painting that she started in 2013 when she was living with her grandmother. And it finally ends up in an art show, and it's totally changed. It's layers upon layers of paint, but Aria can look at it and see what was originally there and know that. And in the same interview that I watched with Malinda Lo, she described her book, this book, as being a mirror of that, because when she looks at this book, she can see the book that she wrote in 2013, the pieces of it that remained, and the paint underneath. And we can't see that as readers. So she knows that it's there. And so she had this in her mind while creating it. And the parallels between those two stories makes a really neat connection. It is interesting to read this book as a companion novel. I wouldn't necessarily say that you have to read Last Night at the Telegraph Club first to read this book, but if you have read it, it is nice to see some characters pop up and to learn what happens to them. I really enjoyed it. It was very different from Last Night at the Telegraph Club, but it was well written and it was a very detailed story. The setting is so much a part of this book, just like it was in Last Night at the Telegraph Club. And I like the way that Malinda Lo does that. She really places you there where she's writing. So whether or not you have read Last Night at the Telegraph Club, I highly recommend that you give A Scatter of Light by Malinda Lo a try. Thank you for joining me for this special episode of Teen Pride Book Talks, the program where I take a little bit of time to look at young adult novels that are representative of and inclusive of folks in the LGBTQ plus community.